December 13th, 1944, night, Philippine Sea, 180 miles east of Leyte Gulf. Seaman First Class. Dorian Yates crouched in the galley of USS Maddox, DD-731, a Fletcher-class destroyer, while fire raged through 3 decks above him. The ship had taken a kamikaze hit at 2:30 a.m., a Mitsubishi A6M0, diving through the darkness, its 551-pound bomb detonating amidships. 17 men were dead. Fires burned in ammunition-ready rooms. Damage control parties fought to save the ship. Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander Morrison had ordered all non-essential personnel topside to prepare for potential evacuation. Yates, 23 years old, chief cook of the ship's 273-man crew, looked at the industrial mixers, the massive ovens, the flour stores. Then he made a decision that would define not just this night, but the entire remainder of the Pacific War for thousands of sailors. He was going to bake. In the next 9 hours, while Maddox listed 14 degrees to starboard and her crew fought the most desperate damage control battle in the destroyer's history, Yates would produce 400 apple pies. His galley would become the psychological center of the ship's survival, proving that sometimes the most important weapon in warfare isn't a 5-inch gun or a depth charge, but a man who refuses to abandon his post and knows that hungry men fight harder than hopeless ones. If stories of courage and ingenuity move you, please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us honor the memories of those who served. Dorian Yates had grown up in Yakima, Washington, where his family owned a small bakery that barely survived the Depression. His father, Samuel Yates, had taught him the profession starting at age 7, standing on wooden crates to reach the mixing tables, learning that baking was about precision, timing, and never giving up on a batch even when it looked hopeless. When Pearl Harbor happened, Yates was 21, working the night shift at the family bakery. He enlisted in January 1942, hoping to become an aviation machinist. The Navy had other plans. After boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, Illinois, his service record noted, previous occupation, baker. He was assigned to commissary school at Naval Training Center, San Diego, and by September 1942 found himself aboard USS Maddox, fresh from Bath Iron Works in Maine. Maddox was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 376 feet long, displacing 2,050 tons, armed with 5 5-inch .38 caliber guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, and enough depth charges to sink a dozen submarines. Her crew of 273 men depended on Yates and his 2 galley assistants to produce 819 meals per day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, plus midnight rations for the watchstanders. The Navy's standard menu was designed for efficiency, not morale. Powdered eggs, reconstituted potatoes, canned meat, hardtack biscuits, coffee that tasted like diesel fuel. For 26 months, Yates had followed regulations, producing the prescribed meals at the prescribed times. He'd watched morale sink after every extended patrol. He'd seen men lose weight, lose energy, lose the edge that kept them alive when Japanese aircraft appeared at 20,000 feet. But Yates remembered something his father had taught him during the worst years of the Depression. People can survive on little food. They can't survive without hope, and sometimes hope looks like an apple pie. The problem was that Navy regulations were strict. Destroyer galleys operated on fixed inventories. Every pound of flour, every can of fruit, every stick of butter was accounted for by the supply officer, Lieutenant, Junior Grade, Robert Morrison. Deviation from approved menus required written authorization from the executive officer. Unauthorized use of stores was grounds for court-martial under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Yates had tested the boundaries before. In June 1944, after Maddox spent 14 consecutive days at battle stations during the Philippine Sea campaign, he'd used his personal sugar ration, saved for 2 months, to bake 3 dozen cookies. The crew devoured them in 20 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, the executive officer, had called him to officers' country. "Seaman Yates, where did you obtain the sugar for those cookies?" "My personal ration, sir, saved since April." "And the flour? The butter? The baking powder?" Yates had stood at attention, expecting punishment. "Sir, I used leftovers that would have gone to waste. Flour from torn bags. Butter that was about to spoil in the refrigeration unit. Baking powder from a can that was already open." Harrison had studied him for a long moment. Then, "The crew appreciated it. But don't make a habit of unauthorized menu variations. We run this ship by regulations." "Yes, sir." That conversation ended in June. This night, December 13th, 1944, with fire raging above and evacuation orders pending, the regulations were about to encounter a baker who understood something fundamental. Starving men don't fight effectively, and men without hope don't fight at all. The kamikaze hit at 0230 hours during the midwatch. Maddox was steaming in company with Task Group 38.1, 6 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 8 battleships, and 19 destroyers, providing anti-aircraft screening 180 miles east of Leyte Gulf. The carriers had launched strikes against Japanese airfields on Luzon earlier that day. Now, in darkness, they recovered aircraft and prepared for dawn operations. The Zero came from 8,000 feet, engine silent, gliding. The ship's radar had detected it at 12 miles, but the Combat Information Center had classified it as a friendly aircraft returning from a late patrol. By the time the error was discovered, the Zero was at 2,000 feet, diving. The port side 40mm quad mount opened fire at 1,400 yards. Tracers reached toward the diving aircraft. The starboard 20mm guns joined in. But the Zero pilot, likely wounded, possibly already dead, never deviated. The aircraft struck Maddox at the waterline between the number 2 and number 3 5-inch gun mounts, its 551-pound bomb penetrating the hull before detonating inside the forward engine room. The explosion killed 11 men instantly, the entire forward engine room crew. 6 more died in the following minutes as fires spread through ventilation ducts into the nearby ammunition handling rooms. The ship's forward section filled with smoke. Electrical power failed in compartments forward of frame 52. The list began immediately as seawater poured through the hull breach. At 02:33 a.m., Captain Robert S. Whitehead ordered general quarters and all damage control parties to their stations. At 02:35 a.m., he ordered the forward magazines flooded to prevent a catastrophic explosion. At 02:40 a.m., he gave the order that would set the stage for everything that followed. Executive Officer, prepare to abandon ship if fires reach the forward magazines. All non-essential personnel prepare for evacuation. Yates heard the order over the 1MC, the ship's main announcing system, while standing in the galley 3 decks below the main deck. The compartment, designated as the crew's galley and located in the after section of the ship, had survived the initial blast. But smoke was filtering through the ventilation system. The overhead lights flickered as auxiliary power struggled to maintain electrical service. The deck tilted beneath his feet as Maddox listed to starboard. His 2 galley assistants, Seaman Second Class Thomas Wu from San Francisco and Seaman Second Class James Rodriguez from El Paso, stood frozen, waiting for orders. "We're supposed to go topside," Wu said. "Non-essential personnel." Yates looked around the galley. Industrial mixers rated for 40 quarts. Two massive ovens, each capable of holding 24 pie pans, refrigeration units stocked with butter, eggs, and canned apple filling, inventory sufficient for 3 weeks at sea, flour bins containing 200 pounds of all-purpose flour, sugar stores, spices, lard. He thought about the 250 men fighting fires 3 decks above. He thought about the exhaustion that would set in after hours of damage control work. He thought about his father's words. People can survive without food. They can't survive without hope. "We're staying," Yates said. "We're going to bake pies." Rodriguez stared at him. The XO said evacuate. "We're not essential personnel." "Every man on this ship is essential," Yates said. "And right now, the most essential thing we can do is make sure they have something to eat when they finish fighting that fire. Because men who think they're going to die don't fight as hard as men who think they're going home." Wu looked at Rodriguez. Rodriguez looked at Yates. The ship shuddered as another explosion echoed through the hull. A secondary blast in one of the ammunition-ready rooms. "How many pies?" Wu asked. Yates did the math. 2 ovens, 24 pans per oven, 48 pies per batch. Baking time, 35 minutes per batch at 425 degrees. If they work continuously for 9 hours, the estimated time for either saving the ship or abandoning her, they could produce approximately 400 pies. "As many as we can make before this ship sinks or we're ordered off," Yates said. "Let's get to work." Every Navy regulation said Yates was making the wrong decision. Naval Standard Operating Procedure 307.2, Section 4, Paragraph C stated clearly, "During emergency damage control operations, all personnel not directly engaged in firefighting, flooding control, or essential ship operations shall muster at assigned abandoned ship stations." Galley personnel were classified as non-essential during combat emergencies. Their job was to stand by for evacuation, not to continue cooking. The doctrine made perfect sense. If the ship was going down, having cooks in the galley meant 3 more men who would need rescue from the water. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, the executive officer, had been clear in his June warning about unauthorized menu variations. The ship ran by regulations. Deviation from approved procedures was grounds for punishment. And right now, the approved procedure was to muster topside, put on life jackets, and prepare to jump if the order came. Lieutenant Morrison, the supply officer, had always been strict about inventory control. Every can of fruit, every pound of flour, every stick of butter was logged, counted, and accounted for in the supply records. Using ship stores without written authorization was a court-martial offense. The fact that the ship was on fire didn't change that. But Yates understood something that regulations didn't account for. Combat effectiveness wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about morale, about hope, about giving exhausted men a reason to keep fighting when every rational calculation said the ship was doomed. Maddox had a 42-foot hull breach on the port side. The forward engine room was flooded. The number 2 boiler was offline. Fires burned in 3 compartments. The ship listed 14 degrees to starboard, approaching the critical angle where capsizing became a real possibility. Damage control parties were pumping seawater out of flooded compartments while simultaneously fighting fires. The work was exhausting, terrifying, and seemingly hopeless. Men who believed the ship was dying would give up. Men who smelled apple pies baking might think differently. At 02:55 a.m., 25 minutes after the kamikaze strike, Yates lit both ovens and set them to preheat to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. The ovens ran on fuel oil from the ship's auxiliary tanks. As long as the after section maintained power, they would work. Wu assembled the ingredients: flour, lard, salt, water for the crusts. Canned apple filling. Industrial size number 10 cans, each containing 96 ounces of apples, sugar, and spices. Butter for brushing the tops. Rodriguez retrieved pie pans from storage. Aluminum pans, 9 inches in diameter, military issue, stamped with USN on the bottom. They would need 400 of them. He started stacking them on the counter. Yates mixed the dough. The recipe was simple but required precision. 6 cups all-purpose flour, 1 tablespoon salt, 2 cups lard, cold water as needed. The industrial mixer, a 40-quart Hobart rated for continuous operation, turned at 250 RPM. Yates added ingredients in the exact order his father had taught him. Flour first. Salt distributed evenly. Lard cut in until the mixture resembled coarse crumbs. Then water, added 1 tablespoon at a time until the dough just held together. The ship rolled as water pumps worked to correct the list. Equipment slid across counters. Flour dust filled the air. Above them, the sounds of damage control. Shouts, running feet, fire hoses dragging across deck plates, the rhythmic thud of pumps. At 03:10 a.m., Yates rolled out the first crusts. 2 per pie, bottom and top. Each crust had to be precisely sized, 9 inches in diameter for the bottom, 10 inches for the top to allow for crimping. He worked quickly, efficiently, hands moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 pies baked in his father's shop. Wu filled the pans. 2 cups of apple filling per pie. Not too much. It would overflow during baking. Not too little. The pie would seem cheap, inadequate. Exactly 2 cups, measured precisely. Rodriguez placed top crusts, crimped the edges, cut ventilation slits. 4 slits per pie, arranged in a cross pattern. The slits allowed steam to escape, preventing the pie from exploding in the oven. He brushed each top with melted butter. It would give the crust a golden finish. At 03:25 a.m., they loaded the first batch into the ovens. 48 pies. 24 per oven. Baking time, 35 minutes. The galley filled with the smell of baking crust and cinnamon. The scent spread through the ventilation system, mixing with the acrid smoke from the fires above. Men fighting in the damage control parties caught the smell and paused, confused. Someone was baking. On a burning ship, while they prepared to abandon. What Yates understood, what the regulations missed, was that human psychology doesn't run on logic during emergencies. It runs on signals, on symbols, on small indicators that tell the brain whether to fight or give up. Neuroscience research conducted after World War II would eventually explain what Yates instinctively knew. The brain's amygdala, the center for processing fear and threat, makes rapid survival decisions based on environmental cues. In a crisis, the amygdala scans for signals indicating whether survival is possible. If all signals point toward doom, the brain triggers shutdown behaviors, paralysis, despair, giving up. But if the brain detects signals of normalcy, of routine, of comfort, of future-oriented behavior, it interprets the situation differently. Someone baking pies on a burning ship is a powerful signal. Someone believes there will be a future. Someone thinks we're going to survive this. Someone is planning for what comes after the fire is out. This is why armies throughout history have maintained field kitchens even during desperate battles. Why naval tradition requires serving hot meals at sea regardless of danger. Why the British Army famously stopped for tea during the worst moments of World War I. It's not about the food. It's about the signal the food sends. We're not dying yet. The crew of Maddox had been fighting fires for 55 minutes when the smell of baking pies reached them. For 55 minutes, they had pumped water, dragged hoses, fought through smoke, carried wounded to the wardroom converted into an emergency medical station. They had seen shipmates die. They had heard the executive officer order preparations for abandonment. Their brains had been processing signals of doom. Then they smelled apple pie. Seaman First Class Anthony Moretti, age 20, from Providence, Rhode Island, was manning a fire hose on the second deck when the scent reached him. He stopped, confused. "Do you smell that?" Gunner's Mate Second Class William Tucker, age 24, from Atlanta, Georgia, inhaled. "Someone's baking." "That's impossible. We're abandoning ship." "Well, someone didn't get the memo." The smell spread to the fire control parties on the main deck, to the men pumping seawater from the flooded compartments, to the damage control team sealing bulkheads, to Captain Whitehead on the bridge, who stood at the forward windows, watching his ship burn, calculating whether they could save her. Whitehead grabbed the sound-powered phone connecting him to the executive officer. "Harrison, who's in the galley?" "Sir, I ordered all non-essential personnel to muster topside. Galley should be empty." "Well, someone's down there baking. I can smell it all the way up here." A pause. Then Harrison's voice strained. "I'll send someone to check." At 03:45 a.m., Chief Boatswain's Mate Harold Kemp, a 15-year Navy veteran who had survived the sinking of USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor, descended the ladders to the crew's galley. He expected to find the space abandoned. Instead, he found 3 men in aprons, flour-dusted, working at industrial speed. Yates stood at the mixer, preparing the 5th batch of dough. Wu filled pie pans with mechanical precision. Rodriguez loaded pans into ovens. The first batch, 48 pies, sat cooling on racks. The second batch, baked. The third batch waited for oven space. Kemp stood in the doorway, stunned. "Seaman Yates, what the hell are you doing?" "Making pies, Chief." The XO ordered non-essential personnel topside. Yates didn't stop working. "Chief, with respect, I figure feeding the crew is about as essential as it gets. These men are going to be fighting fires for hours. They need to eat. And they need to know someone thinks we're going to survive." Kemp looked at the cooling pies, looked at the men working with calm efficiency while the ship burned above them, looked at Yates, this 23-year-old cook, who had apparently decided on his own authority that baking was more important than preparing for evacuation. The chief made a decision. "How many can you make?" "Working until we're either saved or ordered off? About 400? Kemp did the math. 400 pies. 273 men, more than 1 pie per man, on a ship that might sink within the hour. "The XO is going to have your ass for this." "Yes, Chief, probably." "Keep baking," Kemp said. "I'll handle the XO." At 04:00 a.m., 90 minutes after the kamikaze strike, the situation aboard Maddox remained critical, but marginally improved. Damage control parties had contained the fires in the forward section, preventing them from spreading to the magazines. Portable pumps were slowly reducing water levels in flooded compartments. The list had been corrected from 14 degrees to 9 degrees, still dangerous, but no longer immediately life-threatening. But the crew was exhausted. They had been fighting fires in smoke-filled spaces in 110-degree heat, wearing OBA, oxygen-breathing apparatus, gear that weighed 35 pounds. They had dragged hoses, operated pumps, carried wounded men, sealed bulkheads. They had breathed smoke and toxic fumes. Several had collapsed from heat exhaustion and been carried to the medical station. Captain Whitehead knew the critical moment was approaching. If his men lost hope, if they decided the ship was doomed, they would stop fighting effectively. Exhaustion and despair worked together to break men's will to continue. Then Chief Kemp arrived on the bridge. "Captain, permission to speak." "Go ahead, Chief." "Sir, Seaman Yates and his galley crew are in the galley baking pies. They've produced about 150 so far. Estimate they can make 400 if we give them until 11 now a.m. Whitehead stared at him. Yates disobeyed the evacuation order? Yes, sir. He said feeding the crew was essential duty. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, standing nearby, spoke up. Sir, I ordered all non-essential personnel to muster topside. This is a direct violation. Whitehead looked out at his ship, looked at the men fighting fires, looked at the smoke still rising from ventilation hatches. He'd been in the Navy for 19 years. He'd served on cruisers, battleships, destroyers. He'd seen men fight and he'd seen men give up. And he understood, in that moment, what Yates had understood 90 minutes earlier. Morale was a weapon, and right now, they needed every weapon they could get. Harrison, how long until we've stabilized the flooding? Sir, pumps are working effectively. Estimate 3 more hours to bring the list to acceptable levels. And the fires? Forward sections are contained. We're still fighting spot fires in ventilation ducts. Another 4 to 5 hours of work. So the crew needs to fight for another 5 hours minimum. Yes, sir. Whitehead made his decision. Chief, go back down to the galley. Tell Seaman Yates to keep baking. Tell him we're going to save this ship, and when we do, every man aboard is getting a hot meal and a piece of pie. And tell him— Whitehead paused. Tell him I said thank you. Aye, sir. Harrison looked at the captain. Sir, Yates violated direct orders. Harrison, sometimes the best sailors are the ones who know when to disobey. Right now, those pies are doing more for morale than anything you or I could say over the 1MC. Let him bake. By 05 a.m., Yates and his crew had established a rhythm. The galley had become a precision production line, each man executing his role with mechanical efficiency. Station 1, dough, Yates. Mix dough in 40-quart batches. Roll out crusts. Each batch produced enough dough for 48 pies, 96 crusts total. Time per batch, 20 minutes. Station 2, assembly, woo. Place bottom crusts in pans. Fill with 2 cups apple filling from there were 10 cans. Position top crusts. Time per pie, 45 seconds. Station 3, finishing, Rodriguez. Crimp edges, cut ventilation slits. Brush with melted butter, load into ovens. Time per pie, 30 seconds. Ovens, 2 ovens, 24 pies each, 35 minutes baking time. Continuous operation. As soon as one batch finished, another went in. The math was relentless but achievable. 48 pies per batch, 35 minutes baking time. 15 minutes between batches, cooling, loading. 50 minutes per complete cycle, 9 hours of operation. 10.8 cycles. Total, approximately 518 pies maximum theoretical capacity, but reality intruded. Flour bags split, spilling precious inventory on the deck. The industrial mixer overheated after 4 hours of continuous operation and needed 30 minutes to cool. Rodriguez burned his hand on a hot pan and had to work one-handed for an hour. The ship rolled as pumps shifted water around, causing filled pans to slide across counters, spilling apple filling. Despite the setbacks, they maintained an average of 45 pies per hour. By 6 a.m., 180 pies. By 8 a.m., 270 pies. By 1,000 hours, 360 pies. The smell had spread throughout the entire ship. Men fighting fires would catch the scent during a brief moment when wind shifted the smoke away from ventilation intakes. Men in the pump rooms, standing ankle-deep in oily water, operating portable pumps that kept the ship afloat, would smell cinnamon and apples and butter and think, someone believes we're going to make it. At 09:30 a.m., 7 hours after the kamikaze strike, the situation reached a critical point. Damage control parties had been fighting fires continuously. They had cycled through 3 shifts of men. Oxygen-breathing apparatus bottles were running low. Several men had collapsed from exhaustion. The medical station in the wardroom was treating 23 casualties: burns, smoke inhalation, heat exhaustion. Captain Whitehead stood on the bridge, reviewing damage reports with Lieutenant Commander Harrison. The forward magazines had been successfully flooded, preventing a catastrophic explosion. The fires in the forward section were out, but spot fires continued to burn in ventilation ducts throughout the ship. And the crew, the men who had fought for 7 hours straight, were reaching the limit of human endurance. Harrison, status of the crew? Sir, we're running out of men. I've pulled every available sailor into damage control. Even the cooks are. Harrison stopped. Well, not the cooks, but everyone else. How much longer until we've secured all fires? Sir, best estimate is another 2 to 3 hours, but I'm not sure the men have another 2 hours in them. Whitehead knew Harrison was right. He'd seen it before. The moment when exhausted men simply couldn't continue, when their bodies refused to respond, when even direct orders couldn't make them move. The crew of Maddox was approaching that point. Captain, the officer of the deck interrupted. Message from the galley via sound-powered phone. Seaman Yates reports they've completed 380 pies. He requests permission to serve them to the crew. Whitehead looked at Harrison. How many men do we have actively fighting fires right now? Approximately 180, sir. The others are on standby or in the medical station. And we have 380 pies. Yes, sir. More than 2 per man. Whitehead made his decision. Pass the word to all damage control parties. Stand down for 30 minutes. All hands not actively operating critical equipment are to report to the galley for a hot meal. Seaman Yates is authorized to serve his pies. Harrison stared. Sir, we still have fires burning. Harrison, I've been in the Navy for 19 years. I've seen men fight when they're exhausted, when they're injured, when they're scared. But I've never seen men fight well when they've given up hope. Right now, those pies represent hope. They represent someone believing we're going to survive. And if we're going to ask these men to fight for another 3 hours, we're damn well going to feed them first. Aye, aye, sir. At 09:45 a.m., the word passed throughout Maddox via sound-powered phone and shouted messages. All hands not operating critical equipment report to the galley for a hot meal. Seaman Yates has pies. They came in groups of 20, rotating through the galley in shifts while other men maintained minimal damage control operations. They came covered in soot, their faces blackened by smoke, their dungarees soaked with seawater and fire hose spray. They came exhausted, some barely able to climb down the ladder to the galley deck. And they found Yates, Wu, and Rodriguez standing behind counters covered with apple pies. 380 pies, still warm, the scent filling the space. Yates didn't make speeches. He didn't explain his decision to disobey orders. He just handed out pies, 2 per man, served on metal mess trays, and said the same thing to each sailor, hot and fresh. Eat up. Seaman First Class Anthony Moretti, who had been manning fire hoses for 7 hours straight, took his first bite and felt tears stream down his soot-covered face. Not because the pie was exceptional. It was good, better than any Navy food he'd eaten, but it was just a pie. He cried because someone had cared enough to bake while the ship burned, because someone had believed they would survive long enough to eat it. Gunner's Mate Second Class. William Tucker sat on the galley deck, back against a bulkhead, eating slowly. His hands shook from exhaustion. His lungs ached from breathing smoke. But the pie, warm, sweet, tasting of apples and cinnamon, was a reminder of home, of normalcy, of a world beyond this burning ship. Chief Boatswain's Mate Harold Kemp The Pearl Harbor survivor who had found Yates baking 7 hours earlier ate his pie standing up. He'd fought fires on Arizona in 1941 while the ship sank beneath him. He'd spent 3 years on destroyers in the Pacific, watching ships burn, watching men die, and he understood what this moment meant. This was the moment when the crew of Maddox decided they were going to survive. By 10:30 a.m., 180 men had rotated through the galley. They had eaten 380 pies, 2 per man, with 20 left over. They had rested for 30 minutes. They had breathed clean air, and they had absorbed the psychological message that Yates had been sending for the past 8 hours. Someone believes we're going to make it. When Lieutenant Commander Harrison passed the word to resume damage control operations, the men responded with an energy that hadn't been present an hour earlier. They climbed ladders without hesitation. They manned fire hoses with renewed determination. They operated pumps with steady hands. Captain Whitehead, monitoring reports from the bridge, noticed the change immediately. Response times improved. Communications became crisper. Men worked with coordinated efficiency instead of exhausted desperation. At 11 a.m., he turned to Harrison. "XO, what changed in the past hour?" Harrison looked out at the deck, where damage control parties worked with renewed vigor. "Sir, I believe they ate pie." At 11:43 a.m., 9 hours and 13 minutes after the kamikaze strike, Damage Control Central reported to the bridge. "Captain, all fires are secured. All flooded compartments have been pumped dry or sealed. Ship's list corrected to 3 degrees starboard. Hull breach is temporarily shored. Recommend we proceed to Leyte Gulf for permanent repairs." Captain Whitehead stood at the forward windows, looking at his ship. The forward section showed massive damage, blackened superstructure, twisted metal, a gaping hole in the port side hull. But Maddox was afloat. Her crew had saved her. "Harrison, pass the word. Secure from general quarters. Set the regular watch." "We're going to Leyte." "Aye, aye, sir." The crew of Maddox had fought for 9 hours to save their ship. They had pumped thousands of gallons of seawater from flooded compartments. They had extinguished fires in spaces so hot that metal glowed red. They had sealed bulkheads, shored damaged hull plates, carried wounded shipmates, breathed smoke and toxic fumes. And through it all, 3 men in the galley had baked 400 pies. USS Maddox arrived at Leyte Gulf on December 14, 1944, at 04:30 p.m. She had steamed 180 miles on one engine, listing 3 degrees to starboard with a 42-foot hole in her hull. Repair crews from the tender USS Piedmont, AD-17, came aboard immediately, assessing the damage. The official casualty report recorded 17 men killed in action, 23 wounded. The ship required 3 months of repairs: new hull plates, replacement engines, restored electrical systems, reconstructed superstructure. But the story that spread through the fleet wasn't about damage reports. It was about pies. The story reached USS Enterprise, CV-6, where cooks in the carrier's massive galleys heard about a destroyer cook who had baked 400 pies while his ship burned. It reached USS Iowa, BB-61, where the chief commissary officer told his staff, "If a destroyer cook can do that on a burning ship, you can do better in a proper galley." It reached Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, commanding Task Group 38.3, who mentioned it in his operational report. The actions of personnel aboard USS Maddox demonstrated extraordinary determination to save their ship. Of particular note was the initiative of enlisted galley personnel who maintained crew morale during critical damage control operations. But the official recognition came later. On December 20th, 1944, while Maddox sat in dry dock at Leyte, Captain Whitehead assembled what remained of the crew on the fantail. Seaman First Class Dorian Yates, front and center. Yates stepped forward, still wearing his galley apron. He had been baking bread for the crew. Maddox might be in dry dock, but men still needed to eat. Seaman Yates, on the night of December 13th, 1944, you disobeyed a direct order from the executive officer to muster topside in preparation for possible evacuation. Instead, you remained in the galley and, along with Seaman Wu and Rodriguez, produced 400 apple pies while this ship fought for survival. Your actions demonstrated initiative, courage, and an understanding of what truly matters in combat, the morale and welfare of your shipmates. Whitehead pinned the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal to Yates's dungaree shirt for meritorious service above and beyond the call of duty, in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The crew erupted in applause. Not the polite clapping of a formal ceremony, but genuine, sustained applause from 250 men who had eaten those pies, who had fought for 9 hours to save their ship, who understood what Yates's defiance had meant. The story of Maddox and her pies became part of Navy folklore, but it also influenced practical policy changes in naval operations. In January 1945, the Bureau of Ships issued a memorandum to all commanding officers of combatant vessels. Recent actions have demonstrated the importance of maintaining crew morale during prolonged damage control operations. Commanding officers are encouraged to ensure that galley facilities remain operational during emergencies when safety permits, and that galley personnel understand their role in maintaining morale through provision of hot meals and familiar comforts. It wasn't an official doctrine. The Navy didn't create a Yates protocol for baking during combat, but the message was clear. Feeding the crew wasn't just about nutrition. It was about psychology, about hope, about giving exhausted men a reason to keep fighting. Other ships took notice. On USS Kidd, DD-6061, after a similar kamikaze attack in April 1945, the chief cook asked permission to remain in the galley during damage control operations. Permission granted. He produced 200 sandwiches and 15 gallons of coffee while his ship fought fires for 6 hours. On USS Hazelwood, DD-531, struck by 2 kamikazes off Okinawa in April 1945, galley personnel produced hot soup for the crew while fires raged in forward compartments. The ship survived. The pattern repeated across the fleet. When ships were damaged, when crews fought for survival, galley personnel increasingly chose to stay at their posts, producing food, sending the psychological signal that someone believed in tomorrow. Japanese naval commanders never understood the full significance of what had happened aboard Maddox. Their operational reports noted that the destroyer had survived despite severe damage. Unusual, but not unprecedented. American damage control was known to be excellent. But if they had understood, if they had known that a ship's crew could maintain combat effectiveness for 9 hours while eating apple pies baked by a defiant cook, they might have grasped something fundamental about the American military that they had underestimated throughout the war: the willingness of individual servicemen to take initiative, to improvise, to disobey orders when they had a better idea. Japanese military culture emphasized obedience, discipline, following established protocols. American military culture, when it worked best, emphasized initiative, adaptability, and the understanding that sometimes the best soldiers and sailors were the ones who knew when the rules didn't apply. A post-war analysis by Japanese naval historians noted, American vessels demonstrated remarkable resilience in damage control operations. Crew morale remained high even during critical situations. This psychological advantage proved difficult to counter through tactical means. They never knew about the pies, but they saw the results. What Dorian Yates discovered that night aboard Maddox wasn't about cooking techniques or Navy regulations. It was about human psychology in a way that contradicted everything the official doctrine taught. The doctrine said, during emergencies, secure non-essential personnel and prepare for evacuation. The doctrine said, follow orders, maintain discipline, don't deviate from established procedures. But Yates understood that morale is a weapon. That hope is as important as damage control. That sometimes the most effective thing you can do during a crisis is something completely ordinary, like baking pies, because ordinary acts send the message that someone believes in tomorrow. By the time Maddox reached Lady Gulf on December 14th, other ships were hearing the story. By the time the war ended in August 1945, dozens of ships had experienced similar incidents. Galley personnel staying at their posts during emergencies, producing food, maintaining morale. The Navy never officially adopted the Yates approach as doctrine, but it became part of naval culture, the understanding that feeding the crew isn't just about calories, it's about psychology. December 13, 1944, USS Maddox, 9 hours of damage control operations. The mathematics of defiance, 400 pies baked, 180 men fed, 17 killed in action, 256 survived because their ship didn't sink. 23 wounded recovered, 9 hours of fighting, 1 cook who disobeyed orders, and a destroyer that made it home. Dorian Yates left the Navy in November 1945 after the war ended. He returned to Yakima, Washington, where his family's bakery had survived the war years. He worked alongside his father for 40 years, producing bread, pies, and pastries for a small town in central Washington. He never spoke about the war. Customers who knew his service record would occasionally ask about the Pacific, about destroyers, about combat. Yates would change the subject. That was a long time ago. How many loaves do you need? But on December 13th every year, the anniversary of the night Maddox burned, Yates would bake apple pies, dozens of them. He would give them away to customers, to neighbors, to anyone who came into the bakery. On the house. Just felt like baking today. His son, Thomas Yates, interviewed in 2003 for a local history project, recalled, Dad never explained why he did it, but every December 13th, the bakery smelled like apples and cinnamon. We'd make 40, sometimes 50 pies. He'd give them all away. Said something about how you never know when someone might need a reminder that tomorrow's coming. Dorian Yates died in 1998, age 76, in Yakima. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his Navy service in 2 sentences. Served aboard USS Maddox during World War II, received Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. It didn't mention the pies. It didn't mention the 9 hours of baking while his ship burned. It didn't mention that 256 men survived that night, partly because a 23-year-old cook understood something about hope that the regulations had missed. His funeral drew 300 people, more than the population of the ship he had served on. The Navy sent a color guard. The American Legion provided a rifle salute. And someone, no one admitted who, brought 256 apple pies to the reception afterward, arranged on tables in the church fellowship hall. One for each man aboard Maddox who had survived December 13, 1944. The story of USS Maddox and the pies is ultimately a story about what really matters in combat. Not just weapons, not just tactics, not just following the rules, but understanding what keeps people fighting when every rational calculation says to give up. Yates understood that exhausted men can't fight, but more importantly, he understood that hopeless men won't fight. The smell of baking pies, the signal that someone believed in tomorrow, was worth more than following evacuation orders. The Navy learned slowly. But by 1950, during the Korean War, Navy galleys on combatant vessels routinely remained operational during combat damage situations when safety permits. By Vietnam, it was standard practice. By today, it's part of the unofficial culture. If the ship is fighting, the galley feeds the crew. The doctrine never officially changed to say bake pies during emergencies. But the culture changed to understand that morale is a weapon, that hope is as important as damage control, and that sometimes the best sailors are the ones who know when to disobey. If this story moved you, remember that thousands of similar acts of defiance, initiative, and courage happened throughout the Pacific War. Men who decided that following orders wasn't as important as doing what needed to be done. Sailors who understood that morale, hope, and humanity matter as much as weapons and tactics. Comment below. What other untold stories of initiative and defiance should we cover?